some remarks, and then Rick and Damien will give reactions to that. So I'm going to introduce all three of them right now. All standing by on the on-deck circle, so come on in, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to be able to get to know and work with Jeff Brown. He's devoted a tremendous amount of time to the state CO2 EOR work group and to the papers, which have explored these economic issues of how carbon capture projects can get financed and compete in the marketplace. Jeff is at Stanford School of Business, as you've already heard today, where he teaches on energy and finance issues. His prior experience with Merrill Lynch and Goldman Sachs, so he has seen project financing from that perspective as well. So Jeff is going to kind of set the stage, and then we're going to hear from Rick Needham and from Damien Gerard. Rick Needham is a partner with the RISE Fund. He's sector lead for the energy and has vast experience in financing major projects. Also through his prior work at Google, where he was responsible for more than $2.5 billion in renewable energy projects worldwide. He has an MS in aeronautics and astronautics. I think it's great, the wild diversity of different backgrounds that people come to this issue today, including our history major over here. He has his MS from MIT and then an MBA from the Harvard Business School. So we're looking forward to Rick's comments about financing projects that do good things and also make good returns. And then we're going to hear from Damien Gerard, Commercial Director at Climate Investment, responsible for a $1 billion fund, which is part of the Oil and Gas Initiative. Damien works on CCS, methane leakage projects. He has an MBA from the University of Chicago and has been a private sector consultant as well as working for BP for a number of years. So a great and diverse panel of people who have been working on these projects. So we're going to hear from all three of them, and we'll look forward to your questions. Jeff, you want to start us off?
Thanks very much. And I got to say, I'm really happy to see there's so many people I know in the room. Usually, if I knew everybody in the room, I'd be relaxed. But Brad says have to be done in 12 minutes, so now I'm nervous. But look, here's the first thing I wanted to leave you with is, and the three of us have been talking about this, there's a huge difference between finance, right? That's selling stocks and bonds, and business model, which is creating something that is worth financing. Which reminds me, illustratively, when I had to ask my father-in-law for my wife's hand in marriage, and he's very risk averse, as you would be. I mean, first of all, it's me. Right? Second, his life story is he got out of Berlin just ahead of the Gestapo, and shortly after he arrived as a refugee in Shanghai, the Japanese army followed, and then he got out just before the People's Liberation Army showed up, so he's risk averse. So he says, and this is before anyone knew who Goldman was, this Goldman and Sachs, what do they do? And I tried to explain. He said, no, I really, what do they do? This sounds risky. And what do you do? And well, I definitely didn't want to tell him what I did, which was design international currency derivatives. So no. So I said, Joe, look, here's their business model. Everything that happens in America, there's Wall Street, Goldman Sachs is on Wall Street, and dollars go by. And they just clip off pieces. Every time a dollar goes by, they just clip off a piece. He says, oh, that's a good business model. Just like Shanghai. Shanghai, you always have to watch the coins. They curve off a little bit off the edge of every gold coin. He goes, okay, you can marry her. So that's a business model. All right, now we're going to talk about carbon capture finance. So first of all, finance is easy. It's nothing but a combination of sales and bean counting and risk management, which is basically you can sell anything in any amount to professional investors if there's a decent enough reward, which is bean counting, and there's not much chance of losing all your beans, which is risk. So, now, first, with respect to financing carbon capture, we're not waiting for some magic technology bullet. Think about raw natural gas is contaminated with CO2, we take it out. Urea fertilizer is made by capturing CO2 and mixing it with ammonia. We ferment corn, ethanol comes off. And we are not waiting for innovative finance. Okay? So innovative finance, this is innovative finance. People will conclude that if carbon capture is innovative and you have to finance it, then we must need innovative finance. That is not true. If people talk to you about innovative finance, hang onto your wallet with both hands. So, it's about finding a good business model. My job as a finance guy at a power development company was basically to keep hammering on the business model until I had something that I could take to Wall Street without them laughing at me. The guys on Wall Street, you know, if it passed the laugh test, they were happy to take it to institutional investors. And the institutional investors, if there was a good enough reward and there was a very minimal chance of losing all their money, they were happy to buy it. The issue is business model. So I want to show you kind of what it looks like. This is nice and simple. This is the business model of any big capital project. Here I've got a 4 million ton per year capture project. So basically twice as big as Petronova, which cost $500 million for the carbon capture. Billion in, you know, if I'm the investor, down arrow, I paid out $1 billion. And I'm getting 120 million of cash in each year during the life of the project. That's enough to pay me back. Well, how do I get 120 million a year? Which is the next slide. And here, if you look on the right, I've got 120 million coming in from Section 45Q tax credits. I have 80 of sales of CO2 for EOR. That gives me 200 inbound. And I pay away about 80 million a year in operating cost. That leaves me 120. And I spend that 120, 60 to the bank. If I don't pay them back, they'll take the plant, game over. And another 60 distributed to equity investors. That's it. This is not very hard, right? It's like paying a home mortgage. Assuming everything's stable. And so here's the picture, 20 years, assuming life is good and stable. And then we're going to talk about when it isn't. So here I have my 200. That's revenues in. The negative bar is my 80 operating cost outbound. And my net profit line is the green. And the blue is what I have to pay to banks. So this is great, right? This is dead level. This is perfect. This is like a wind farm. All right, now let's talk risk. And so risk is where the people in this room, especially the regulators and the political folks, can really help out. Look, there's two kinds of risks, right? There's risks that are tolerable and manageable, and there's risks that aren't, right? Okay? Right. So tolerable. The risks that professional investors can tolerate are pretty much like dice rule risks, right? There's a nice probability distribution. You know what your mean is. You know what the ups and downs are. Kind of looks like a bell curve. You can work around the chance of a terrible dice roll. What you do, among other things, is you save up reserves, cash reserves, to kind of get you through the lean years. Which is actually, that's the first climate mitigation strategy. That's what Joseph proposed to Pharaoh. You know, save up in the 7 fat years for the 7 lean years. That's cash reserves. On the right, those risks, and those are the risks that tend to be really terrible for carbon capture projects. They're like Russian roulette and the deer hunter. You can't really work around them. And there's a big chance you will die, which is horrible for an institutional investor. So, if we queue up the next one, what I did literally was I took my revenues and I kind of applied the same probabilistic pattern as dice rolls, which actually isn't too crazy for carbon capture. Number one, I'm selling my CO2 in the EOR market. Typically prices go up and down with oil. That's definitely a dice roll. If I've applied my carbon capture on the back of a power plant, Sometimes there's a warm summer, nobody runs their air conditioning, the plant doesn't run much, another dice roll. So all of a sudden, what happens is things are just great, and then I hit some horrible years in year 10 and 11. I go in the hole, but I only go in the hole 72 million. I've got enough reserves to survive that, and things get better. But that's what it looks like. Now, what happens when you layer Russian roulette on? Here, what happens is, after 4 kind of happy years, the regulators decide they're going to apply a special program just for CO2 caught from power plants. And what that's going to do is raise my cost, $5 a ton. It's so small you can barely see it, right? That I had to put a little call out. Right here, just drives my costs up a little. And I keep going. The trouble is then when I get my bad dice rolls in years 10 and 11, now I've really had it because my underlying profitability got eroded. And now instead of going in the hole about 70 million, I go in the hole 112. Game over. It's a shorter chart, right? I got, there's nothing at the end. So what can policy makers do to mitigate those dice rolls? Here's some short prescriptions. One is make it easier to build pipelines. That's a big Russian roulette risk. Another one is make life hard for pipelines that won't act as common carriers and that want to be monopolies. Another one is instead of renewable energy standards, how about clean energy standards so low carbon doesn't get left out of the party? An odd one, invest in the capabilities of your oil and gas regulators. Because if there's a blowout of an old well around a CO2 flood, that gives the naysayers an automatic big talking point. The regulators are actually the industry's friend. Clarify laws about pore space so that it's clear for an investor in plants whether or not the CO2 going into pore space for EOR is interfering with nominal surface rights. Wyoming has a really good statute in this respect. Indirectly, think about severance taxes. By indirect coping with Russian roulette risk, I mean if you make a project strong enough, it can stand the occasional wound. So severance taxes. Texas has reduced severance taxes. Your severance taxes get cut by 75% for CO2 EOR from anthropogenic sources. Don't do like California. California has sales tax on emissions control equipment, and they also have heavy property taxes on emissions control equipment. Texas does the opposite. And for the regulators in the room, think about capacity-based contracts for power plants with capture so that they're not so subject to the dice rolls of does the plant run in the summer when it's cool and nobody needs the air con. So, wrapping up, finance isn't hard. What's hard is finding something that's worth financing. Professional investors don't care about on average. They care about the probability of those bad dice rolls. And professional investors sure as hell do not like playing Russian roulette. So if we can, let's not play that game. And with that, let's turn it over to Rick.
Thanks, Jeff. So I don't have any nifty Russian roulette graphics, but it may come up in the things that I say. Just to give a little bit of background so you know where my comments are coming from, right now I'm leading the energy sector for the RISE Fund. It's a large impact fund, $2 billion fund, focused on making growth stage investments, so later stage investments in companies where we can show not only that they're good financial investments, but they have a positive social or environmental benefit, and we actually underwrite that during the whole process of investing. Previous to that, I was leading, as Jeff mentioned, or I think maybe in the bio, I was leading some of the renewable energy project investing at Google. I've done that for a few years where we deployed $2.5 billion. And that was largely into solar and wind farms. We also did a transmission line. So my comments now about the difficulty or the challenges in financing really come from those experiences. One of the first things that jumps out to me when I think about financing capture projects is when looking at wind and solar projects, a huge part, like probably the most important part of the financing is you have a long-term offtake agreement. That's what gets financed. That's all those green bars that Jeff showed. You have a contractual price and length of time that you agree that that's what the project's going to be earning. That appears to be a challenge in this space because there either isn't a long-term contract, 15, 20 years or so, and B, there is no, as I understand it, kind of fixed price. In the case of EOR, where the price of carbon, the CO2, may actually fluctuate with the price of oil, that becomes problematic for investors. That could be one more of the dice roll versus a Russian roulette one. But another piece of it that was important in the renewable space was those tax credits, those things that help to make the economics work. For solar, it was like an investment tax credit, which really, you have to prove that the plant's actually running for about 5 years, so it doesn't get recaptured. But wind is probably more analogous here, where you have a kind of a production tax credit. For 10 years, you're getting, for every kilowatt hour you produce, you're getting some amount of money as a tax credit. The thing that worked there, though, is there's certainty. That was 10 years, for sure, and you knew the value when you first, decided you wanted to go build a plant. There were, in the wind industry, times when that production tax credit came and went. And there were years where it didn't get renewed, and then the wind industry kind of hit this stall point. But if you had built your wind farm in a year when the tax credit was there, you had that tax credit for 10 years. It wasn't like it went away the next year. So once you got it, you had it. So that certainty, that long-term kind of clarity and certainty on that tax credit is really what made investing work for those projects. Obviously, it's been mentioned before, maybe the most elegant and clear solution here is a long-term, transparent price on carbon, where you have a buyer that has high credit quality, whoever that might be, whether it's, if you want to call it a state or a federal government or someone. That could solve this problem. That could provide you long-term certainty on that price of carbon. But without that, it seems to me like very difficult to actually finance some of these projects. The other thing about the tax incentive, so 45Q looks to me like really interesting, a potential game changer, because you have a certainty over a period of time and you have a certain dollar amount specific, so that's very, very helpful. The challenge with tax equity financing, which is some of the financing that we did when I was at Google, is they have more complicated structures, so you have to find the right investors to put the money in. The developer's not going to have the tax capacity, basically enough profits that they're paying enough taxes that they can use that tax credit themselves. So it just means you need to bring in another investor who can use those tax credits. What that results in is some interesting structures. I'm not sure if ones have been formed today already for carbon capture kinds of projects, but there was a whole industry in forming these interesting structures.
Come back to that.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things is in this day and age, tax equity has hit a bit of a bump. It looks like it should be okay, but basically the corporate tax rate has gone down, which means corporates have less tax capacity. They pay less taxes, so have less tax capacity. And there's some nuances to the tax bill that also make them less sure on exactly what tax they'll owe every year. So they can't with certainty say, I'm going to avoid that much taxes, and I know I'll be able to use all those tax credits. But those are just some of the challenges that I've seen in potential long-term financing of some of these projects. I'll leave it there, but then we can go through questions and talk more about some of those things as well.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Damien, and I feel quite good of being part of the last panel here, being the last one to speak. I feel good about that. It's quite telling. And most of what I had on my notes on my way here to Wyoming have already been talked about here today, so I'm going to have to find some fillers. But I had a question, who is in the financier of CCS project?
Me.
Right. So, I don't know. I mean, it's quite telling, isn't it? I mean, we're probably going to need $200, $300 billion over the next 2 decades to finance the CCS project. It seems to me, with all due respect to geologists and engineers, that probably in later years we're going to have to need a bit of a better balance with people, especially financiers, banks, and other finance pools who need to be educated about this more complex technology. One thing is to do solar and wind, but this is a bit of a different animal. So there will be a journey there over the years to come to bring banks and others to the discussion. I'm part of the OGCI. It's my parent company. It's an organization that was created right after the COP21 and the Paris Agreement as an industry response to the challenge of climate change. We currently have 10 companies members. As Vicky said, mostly are European companies. So we have, of course, some of those companies here, BP and others. But also some national oil companies, including Aramco and Pemex and Petrobras and the Chinese CNPC. So quite a broad range of companies and profiles. As part of the OGCI, last year we created the Climate Investment Fund, which is $1 billion fund financed by the 10 companies in equal amount, with a mandate to invest in 4 big categories. Energy and transport efficiency being the 2 ones. But most importantly, methane fugitive emissions, which is our big focus for this year. And more or less half of the fund will be dedicated to CCS technologies and projects. So that tells how CCS is really one of the key technologies that the industry want to invest in as a fund. We've already started investing in some minor technologies in VC, more on the capture side. And over the past 2 months, I've been screening the world for CCS projects to understand the status of those projects and how the fund could actually help those projects getting off the ground with finance, but also with resourcing. And so there's been quite an eye-opening exercise for me. It's quite new in the job for 3 months to understand the industry. And I've noticed a few repeating themes in the discussion I had with dozens of project developers around the world, not solely here in the US, but in Europe, in Asia, and other parts as well. But first of all, I respect and encourage a lot of the new business model, the utilization. All the discussion we had today are very relevant, and we need to keep on pushing all of these. But also, by and large, I noticed that a lot of these projects, there's a lot of waste in how project developers go about their project. Not necessarily so much here in the US, but in many parts of the world, a lot of people are spending time and a lot of money in reinventing the wheel on technologies that have been already completely demonstrated. Running pilots on amine solvents and spending huge amounts on things that frankly you could get access to quite easily. And I think there was a lot that we could do to provide better tools and access to intelligence on technologies as a whole. Also, each project that I talked to, project developer really pride themselves on being a unique project, groundbreaking, first of a kind. And all this is great, and we've heard a lot of stories of this today. And I think also from a regulator's viewpoint, there is a lot that government try to do to promote innovation. But from project financing's perspective, these are words that don't resonate always very well. First of a kind, groundbreaking, unique, never seen before.
Groundbreaking.
And so, one has to think how to maintain this balance between innovation, and we need the net power of the life, we need to have the inventiveness of the life, and know the utilization, but we also need to have standardization. We also need to understand the piece of kits that we have on the plant so that financiers go there and understand it. In finance, boring is actually better. And the more we can have of those, the better it will be. Out of the 100 projects that I reviewed, 2 were economic on their own rights, without any sort of subsidy or whether it's 45Q or contract for difference or other things. And it's quite telling about how non-commercial CCS still is today, and a lot will have to be done over the next few years. So I'm glad that I could fill the time. I will finish by saying England has won against Tunisia, so well done on those English. The next game will be against my country, Belgium. It's another challenge. So opening for...
If I could, though, I wanted to add one thing to what Rick said, which is, number one, there are some ways to take the bounciness out of that revenue stream. One thing that was proposed in Congress was to allow basically the Department of Energy to do kind of what the Department of Agriculture does with farmers, with putting a floor on the price of wheat or corn. In this case, it would be basically to give long-term floating to fixed price swaps on oil that would then stabilize CO2 prices. So there are ways to deal with that. The 45Q legislation, at least, is rock solid. So if you start by New Year's Eve 2023, you're certain of getting your sequestration credits should you produce, right? Should you actually grab CO2 and put it in the ground? The key thing is whether you run. And the whether you run part is a place where the state regulators can help a lot. So, there are some good things going on. And one last thing I should mention, so I'm sneakily getting more time than Brad. Tax equity is really brutal. It's a very twisted, complex way of allocating profits and losses among partners in a renewable project. One thing that this whole coalition with lots of people in the room supported doing was to make these projects capable of being leased, just like a regular old equipment lease, like airplanes and rail cars. So that's a standardized, easy market that's, $100 billion market, as opposed to these tax schemes that are kind of by appointment only, and there would be as many lawyers involved as you would ultimately have plant operators. So I don't know, we should go around the room for questions now.
Yeah, let me ask one, because the way that you've all framed this, you all talked about a little bit about how this does or doesn't compare with renewables. And Rick, you said, you talked a lot about financing renewables. Those were considered fairly risky at one point.
Yeah.
Jeff, you seem to make it more of a, there's an economic piece to this. If the math works out, the math works out. You can help or hurt by some of the policies that you're doing. And Damien, you said carbon capture plants seem to be a different kind of animal than renewable plants were. So I'm curious, because we've all seen what happened with renewable costs coming down and their proliferation in lots of places. How good of a parallel is there with CCS to what happened with renewables?
Yeah. Well, it's not evident to me that the kind of economies of scale that you've seen in solar and wind that have been achieved mostly through manufacturing are finding their way in an industry like CCS. It's quite different. As I said, each project seems to be unique. And the question is, how do you take a Petronova and have a Petronova 2? We talked a little bit today about serial numbers and getting to number 30. But I think much more needs to be done in making sure that all the learnings that are gained in the first and first X number of plants make their way through the rest. And I think something like program development will be quite useful. We all look at our little plants and think about the little problems we have. I think from a regulator's viewpoint, and if you want to really tackle this at scale and achieve the benefits through an industry, take, for example, what 45Q allows you to do right now. And we talked about ethanol plants, these are pure emission stream, fantastic. You can make it work today. But also, for example, if you look at gas power plants in the United States, and you take those that are relatively inefficient, with a higher emission per megawatt hour, and those that sit literally on top of VOR fields or nearby some facilities, You have today around a dozen plants that could be cost effectively retrofitted with CCS. And the reason is not because of $35, that will help a lot, but because the 45Q acts as a PTC, so the more you produce, the more credit you receive. And so your power price that you sell from the gas plant goes down, and the gas plant goes up the merit order, increasing availability of the plant. If you do that with, say, 10 of these plants today with a rollout program and achieve, take the first 3, implement 2 net power, 2 traditional, technology, and then roll it out by 10 years down the road, you get to a cost point where you can go and roll it out beyond those that sit on the OR. And these are the kind of, programs that need to be put in place, as a public-private partnership, looking at it in the whole industry. The same could be done for steel, the same could be done for cement. Take those industries and go for it.
One of the things that Damon said I think is really important is the technology piece. You could say solar and wind were risky, but they did have this great benefit of being pretty small bite sizes that you could iterate. The iterative cycle for solar and wind was very rapid, right? You could deploy 1,000 turbines, and then next year you're deploying 2,000 turbines, and they're improved. There's slight improvements. Just to Jeff's point, like financiers don't really like any risk at all. Like we were financing a project when I was at Google where we were deploying a quote unquote new GE turbine, right? It was a 2.5 megawatt turbine. They had a whole bunch of other turbines, wind turbines, sorry. And they'd even deployed it in Europe already. But to get the financiers behind this new turbine,
American wind is different than European wind.
And exactly. Yeah. So it's a slightly different frequency, right? So they had some new, different electronics. But it's kind of shocking to me how people look at those and be like, well, that's a big enough risk that we're really concerned about. Needed a DOE loan guarantee, and we were willing to come in as an investor. We didn't think that was that big a risk. But that being said, the technology piece, it has to be kind of underwritten for financiers. They'll look to someone who will validate that turbine and tell them that turbine will operate fine. Then they say, okay, I'll invest in it. With CCS, that appears to be problematic right now because everything is a one-off. It's not a standard thing that you can get someone to validate and say, okay, this is going to work. And it's going to work for 25 years, and we know what the power curve and everything looks like. So that, to me, is one challenge, and maybe that's a way to do it. Actually find the plants where you can deploy the same kind of system with slight improvements that then a financier gets a lot more comfortable with. I mean, I think the variability in the output of a solar and wind farm might be like the variability, it's a little bit different. I mean, you can underwrite that by looking at an assessment, and that's the true roll the dice.
Yeah.
And the way you finance it is like, we'll just assume it's the 10% worst case. It's like 90% of the time the wind farm will be better than this. That's what we'll finance. But what's tougher to do is like utilization. Like if the plant's not getting utilized.
Well, that's, Doug, just to go to your point though, you know what? Dictatorship is a super good business model, right? That is one reason, you say, that's the elephant in the room. Renewables, they made no sense, right? But you could force utilities to buy the output. So in some sense, that's why it's so critical to have, say, clean portfolio standards, low carbon, rather than, well, it's just we have certain technologies we love and we hate other ones regardless of their particular carbon footprint. Yeah, I mean, that's one.
It's always great being the last question of the day, 6 minutes before the end of the day. I'm Roger Ullman with Linden Trust for Conservation. So the one thing that surprised me the most about today is the degree to which almost everybody has said financing is the main barrier, and that's not only for CCS where the technology is more mature, but even for net power, which has had one great demonstration, but one, and carbon engineering, which hasn't had that yet, and even some of the product companies, some of which may be still in the lab, they're all saying financing is a big barrier. The second theme, of course, is that policy support is needed to assure the financing and confidence of continued policy support. So on the theory that excluding a carbon tax, which let's just assert that there will be one, but you first have to get it and then you have to wait for it to escalate enough to make enough difference, that's at least 15 or 20 years from now. So you've got this 15 or 20-year valley of debt that you have to cross with other kinds of policy support. And assuming also that, that there's a limited pool of political capital to be spent on getting great policy support. Jeff, you listed a whole series of things, all of which sound great to me, and I've heard from others an equally long list of other great sounding policy ideas, but has anyone done the work to determine what are the 2 or 3 or 4, some small number of policy support instruments that might be politically feasible with the political capital that could be marshaled for this, and are collectively sufficient to carry this industry through that valley of death for the next 15 or 20 years? Has anyone done that analysis?
Yeah, I mean, the state work group report that we did, there was a thing called putting the puzzle pieces together, and we looked at state tax policy very specifically, so I was quoting from it. But a lot of the things I mentioned, like don't shortchange your oil and gas regulators, that's a state decision, right? And that's, you can show that's state royalties come flowing in Wyoming if you do it right, and if you blow it a couple of times, those royalties stop because the industry gets stopped. And so these don't, my list were things you can do without going on your knees to Capitol Hill in DC. And you know, I think there's a lot that we can do just here in the room, and there's small steps, but 45Q is the key one. I don't know.
See, it feels to me as well that, and we talked a bit about this today. Of course, it's the last session of the day. Procurement power of the government, in my mind, is a very big lever that they can put in place without much of a headache. Whether it is for construction material, we've heard many examples of technologies that produce useful stuff. Whether it is through fuels, there is more that the government could do. In fact, there are already places. I live in San Francisco. The airport of San Francisco has already got today in its RFQ for any civil engineering done in the airport, 5% of the concrete has to be carbon-free. No, let the market work out how to get there. But if you create this demand for low carbon power, this certainty for these products, the market will find solutions to provide them. Without that certainty, and the government gets so much power in some of those products, and it's a very powerful lever without having to go through bipartisan or whatever.
And Roger, I'll also lift up to you, it just got mentioned, but the series of reports that the state CO2 working group did, well, you can find things like a master limited partnership, which is something you have to go to Congress for, but that in conjunction with 45Q really changes the economics of particular projects. So there's a lot in there to look at. Tax-exempt private activity bonds is another. So there are some things, you know, economic kind of triggers in addition to everything that the gentleman mentioned. We're going to need to stop the panel now, but thanks very much. We really appreciate you being here.